Let me say a few words about the implications of a doctrine of deification for Christian living. In a very pragmatic way, what's the payoff on this? What does it matter? What kind of impact does it have? One of the foremost writers on deification in the contemporary period, he's a good friend, is Norman Russell, Dr. Norman Russell. And he wrote this massive study, but then he wrote a shorter book. And at the end of that book on deification, he asked the question, so do we live it? And it was the heading of this chapter, and I remember it stopped me in my tracks, like, do we live it? What does it mean? Is it just a heady doctrine, or do we actually live this? What does it mean? Well, maybe to say at the start, taking a page out of Athanasius, only God can deify. We can do a lot of things, but we cannot deify ourselves, nor can we deify one another. We can contribute to one another's deification by the way we serve and love one another, but only God can deify. So for the purposes of spirituality, the doctrine of deification, you might say, underlines the fact that our true destiny is not in our hands. It's not something we can attain. Not by working harder or saying more prayers or doing things. We cooperate with God, but only God can deify us. And that makes perfect sense. Only God can make us like God. And the means that he offers us are the means by which we can become like God. So I think in terms of spirituality, one of the things it does is it casts us very much into the hands of God. It moves us away from the idea subtly that somehow I'm the author of my own salvation or my own sanctification or my own holiness. Again, a Catholic account of these things sees our response and our role as very important, as essential, in fact, but the focus is on God and what he's done. And a doctrine of deification reminds us from the start, we can't get there from here. Only God can deify us. And so it causes us to look to God in a particular way. And I think that's a great gift to encourage our eyes to look to the one who is the source of these things. Now, having said that, the doctrine of deification also, I describe it as a little bit like what happens when you're, let's say, making a campfire or a fire in a fireplace. And you know what happens when you put the wood, you put the wood too tight and you try to light it, and there's not enough oxygen. You get smoke rather than fire. And then what happens when you lift the logs and you give them space and you allow oxygen to sort of flow? Suddenly, the flame comes up, and the flame often can become very high. It allows the flame, you might say, to expand and to grow. For our moral life, I would say, raising the bar, lifting the bar. What is God after with us? Well, he's not just after being basically good people who do mostly what's right. Of course he wants us to do that. Of course we're meant to do good and avoid evil. But that's not the final goal. The goal isn't just to be slightly better than the next person or not too bad. The goal is to be like God. And it lifts the bar and brings, you might say, oxygen into our pursuit of life in God. It causes us to aim high, remembering from our first point that only God can do this in us. But we're really meant to look like God. And this is nothing more than bringing to the forefront the saying in the end of Matthew 5, you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Like, that's a very high bar. What does that mean? Well, the doctrine of deification is outlining that. It's also the case, take 2 Corinthians 3. We all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of God, are being transformed into the image from one degree of glory to another. This comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. Comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. But we all, by beholding God's glory, are being transformed into his image and likeness. It raises the bar, you might say, for spirituality and for our moral life, the way of life of a Christian. At the same time, I think it's important to remember deification is not some special pathway, a kind of special elevator over here on the side that gets us up higher by its own means. Deification is nothing other than lifting you might say, those logs that are aflame in a way that allows them to fully burn. It's a way of lifting what we already know as the Christian way of life through the sacraments, practicing the virtues, denying ourselves, growing in holiness, embracing the life of the cross, engaging in the Christian seasons and reaping the fullness of their benefits. All these are part and parcel of the deified life. What does the doctrine of deification add to that? It lifts the bar. I think it naturally brings a rich oxygenation, you might say, to the Christian life. And it raises our expectation and says, it's a high bar. I can't possibly get there on my own. But by the grace of God, look at what God has called me to. So there's a way in which it raises our sense of the greatness of our vocation, and at the same time says, and you know what, you can't get there from here. Only God can deify. But practice the way of life, receive the life of God, take full advantage of the avenues he's given. This is what I think the payoff is. It's not a new fancy exotic way to talk about the Christian life. It's not a separate pathway for the elites who are in the know, the Gnostics. No, it's taking Christian life as we know it in the life of the church and giving it a very high bar, raising it up, showing that only God can do it. At the same time, look at what God has called us to. Let's rise to that greatness of this call, receiving the grace and help of God, that we might too be transformed from glory to glory into his image and likeness.